Chapter 3. How the poison of possessions wrought with PILON, and how evil temporarily triumphed in him. The next day PILON went to live in the other house. It was exactly like Danny's house, only smaller. It had its pink rose of Castile over the porch, its weed-grown yard, its ancient barren fruit trees, its red geraniums, and Mrs. Soto's chicken yard was next door. Danny became a great man, having a house to rent, and PILON went up the social scale by renting a house. It is impossible to say whether Danny expected any rent or whether PILON expected to pay any. If they did, both were disappointed. Danny never asked for it, and PILON never offered it. The two friends were often together. Let PILON come by a jug of wine or a piece of meat, and Danny was sure to drop in to visit. And if Danny were lucky or astute in the same way, PILON spent a riotous night with him. Poor PILON would have paid the money if he ever had any, but he never did have. Not long enough to locate Danny. PILON was an honest man. It worried him sometimes to think of Danny's goodness and his own poverty. One night he had $1, acquired in a manner so astounding that he tried to forget it immediately for fear the memory might make him mad. A man in front of the San Carlos Hotel had put the $1 in his hand, saying, "Run down and get 4 bottles of ginger ale. The hotel is out." Such things were almost miracles, PILON thought. One should take them on faith, not worry and question them. He took the $1 up the road to give to Danny, but on the way he bought a gallon of wine, and with the wine he lured 2 plump girls into his house. Danny, walking by, heard the noise and joyfully went in. PILON fell into his arms and placed everything at Danny's disposal. And later, after Danny had helped dispose of one of the girls and half of the wine, there was a really fine fight. Danny lost a tooth and PILON had his shirt torn off. The girls stood, shrieking by, and kicked whichever man happened to be down. At last, Danny got up off the floor and butted one of the girls in the stomach, and she went out the door croaking like a frog. The other girl stole 2 cooking pots and followed her. For a little while, Danny and PILON wept over the perfidy of women. "Thou knowest not what bitches women are," Danny said wisely. "I do know," said PILON. "Thou knowest not." "I do know." "Liar." There was another fight, but not a very good one. After that, PILON felt better about the unpaid rent. Had he not been host to his landlord? A number of months passed. PILON began again to worry about the rent, and as time went by, the worry grew intolerable. At last, in desperation, he worked a whole day cleaning squids for Chin Key and made $2. In the evening, he tied his red handkerchief around his neck, put on his father's revered hat, and started up the hill to pay Danny the $2 on account. But on the way, he bought 2 gallons of wine. "It is better so," he thought. "If I give him hard money, it does not express how warmly I feel toward my friend, but a present now. And I will tell him the 2 gallons cost $5. This was silly, and PILON knew it, but he indulged himself. No one in Monterey better knew the price of wine than Danny. PILON was proceeding happily. His mind was made up. His nose pointed straight toward Danny's house. His feet moved, but steadily in the proper direction. Under each arm he carried a paper bag, and a gallon of wine was in each bag. It was purple dusk, that sweet time when the day's sleeping is over and the evening of pleasure and conversation has not begun. The pine trees were very black against the sky, and all objects on the ground were obscure with dark. But the sky was as mournfully bright as memory. The gulls flew lazily home to the sea rocks after a day's visit to the fish canneries of Monterey. PILON was a lover of beauty and a mystic. He raised his face into the sky, and his soul arose out of him into the sun's afterglow. That not too perfect Pilon, who plotted and fought, who drank and cursed, trudged slowly on, but a wistful and shining Pilon went up to the seagulls where they bathed on sensitive wings in the evening. That Pilon was beautiful, and his thoughts were unstained with selfishness and lust, and his thoughts are good to know. Our Father is in the evening, he thought. These birds are flying across the forehead of the Father. Dear birds, dear seagulls, how I love you all. Your slow wings stroke my heart as the hand of a gentle master strokes the full stomach of a sleeping dog, as the hand of Christ stroked the heads of little children. Dear birds, he thought, fly to Our Lady of Sweet Sorrows with my open heart. And then he said the loveliest words he knew. Ave Maria, gratia plena. The feet of the bad Pilon had stopped moving. In truth, the bad Pilon for the moment had ceased to exist. Hear this, recording angel. There was, nor is, nor ever has been a purer soul than Pilon's at that moment. Galvez, bad bulldog, came to Pilon's deserted legs, standing alone in the dark, and Galvez's bulldog sniffed and went away without biting the legs. A soul washed and saved is a soul doubly in danger, for everything in the world conspires against such a soul. Even the straws under my knees, says St. Augustine, shout to distract me from prayer. Pilon's soul was not even proof against his own memories, for as he watched the birds he remembered that Mrs. Pestano used seagulls sometimes in her tamales, and that memory made him hungry, and hunger tumbled his soul out of the sky. Pilon moved on, once more a cutting mixture of good and evil. Galvez's bad bulldog turned snarling and stalked back, sorry now that he had let go such a perfect chance at Pilon's legs. Pilon hunched his arms to ease the weight of the bottles. It is a fact, verified and recorded in many histories, that the soul capable of the greatest good is also capable of the greatest evil. Who is there more impious than a backsliding priest? Who more carnal than a recent virgin? This, however, may be a matter of appearance. Pilon, just back from heaven, was, although he did not know it, singularly receptive of every bitter wind, toward every evil influence that crowded the night about him. True, his feet still moved toward Danny's house, but there was neither intention nor conviction in them. They awaited the littlest signal to turn about. Already Pilon was thinking how stupendously drunk he could get on 2 gallons of wine, and more, how long he could stay drunk. It was almost dark now. The dirt road was no longer visible, nor the ditches on either side. No moral conclusion is drawn from the fact that at this moment, when Pilon's impulses were balanced as precariously as a feather between generosity and selfishness, at this very moment Pablo Sanchez happened to be sitting in the ditch at the side of the road, wishing he had a cigarette and a glass of wine. Ah, the prayers of the millions, how they must fight and destroy each other on their way to the throne of God. Pablo first heard footsteps, then saw a blurred figure, then recognized Pilon. "Ay, amigo," he said enthusiastically, "what great burden is it thou carriest?" Pilon stopped dead and faced the ditch. "I thought you were in jail," he said severely. "I heard about a goose." "So I was, Pilon," Pablo said jocularly, "but I was not well received. The judge said the sentence did me no good, and the police said I ate more than the allowance for 3 men. And so," he finished proudly, "I am on parole." Pilon was saved from selfishness. True, he did not take the wine to Danny's house, but instantly he invited Pablo to share it at the rented house. If 2 generous paths branch from the high road of life, and only one can be followed, who is to judge which is best? Pilon and Pablo entered the little house joyfully. Pilon lighted a candle and produced 2 fruit jars for glasses. "Health," said Pablo. "Salud," said Pilon. And in a few moments, "Salud," said Pablo. "Mud in your eyes," said Pilon. They rested a little while. "Su servidor," said Pilon. "Down the rat hole," said Pablo. 2 gallons is a great deal of wine, even for 2 paisanos. Spiritually, the jugs may be graduated thus. Just below the shoulder of the first bottle, serious and concentrated conversation. 2 inches farther down, sweetly sad memory. 3 inches more, thoughts of old and satisfactory loves. An inch, thoughts of bitter loves. Bottom of the first jug, general and undirected sadness. Shoulder of the second jug, black, unholy despondency. 2 fingers down, a song of death or longing. A thumb, every other song each one knows. The graduations stop here, for the trail splits, and there is no certainty. From this point on, anything can happen. But let us go back to the first mark, which says serious and concentrated conversation, for it was at that place that Pilon made his coup. "Pablo," he said, "dost thou never get tired of sleeping in ditches, wet and homeless, friendless and alone?" "No," said Pablo. Pilon mellowed his voice persuasively. "So I thought, my friend, when I was a dirty gutter dog. I too was content, for I did not know how sweet a little house is, and a roof, and a garden. Ah, Pablo, this is indeed living." "It's pretty nice," Pablo agreed. Pilon pounced. "See, Pablo, how would you like to rent part of my house? There would never be the cold ground for you any more, never the hard sand under the wharf with crabs getting in your shoes. How would you like to live here with me?" "Sure," said Pablo. "Look, you will pay only $15 a month, and you may use all the house except my bed and all the garden. Think of it, Pablo, and if someone should write you a letter, he will have some place to send it to." "Sure," said Pablo. "That's swell." Pilon sighed with relief. He had not realized how the debt to Danny rode on his shoulder. The fact that he was fairly sure Pablo would never pay any rent did not mitigate his triumph. If Danny should ever ask for money, Pilon could say, "I will pay when Pablo pays." They moved on to the next graduation, and Pilon remembered how happy he had been when he was a little boy. "No care then, Pablo. I knew not sin. I was very happy." "We have never been happy since," Pablo agreed sadly. Chapter 4. How Jesus Maria Corcoran, a good man, became an unwilling vehicle of evil. Life passed smoothly on for Pilon and Pablo. In the morning, when the sun was up clear of the pine trees, when the blue bay rippled and sparkled below them, they arose slowly and thoughtfully from their beds. It is a time of quiet joy, the sunny morning. When the glittery dew is on the mallow weeds, each leaf holds a jewel which is beautiful, if not valuable. This is no time for hurry or for bustle. Thoughts are slow and deep and golden in the morning. Pablo and Pilon, in their blue jeans and blue shirts, walked in comradeship into the gulch behind the house, and after a little time they returned to sit in the sun on the front porch, to listen to the fish horns on the streets of Monterey, to discuss in wondering, sleepy tones the doings of Tortilla Flat. For there are 1,000 climaxes on Tortilla Flat for every day the world wheels through. They were at peace there on the porch, only their toes wriggled on the warm boards when the flies landed on them. "If all the dew were diamonds," Pablo said, "we would be very rich. We would be drunk all our lives." But Pilon, on whom the curse of realism lay uneasily, added, "Everybody would have too many diamonds. There would be no price for them, but wine always costs money. If only it would rain wine for a day, now, and we had a tank to catch it in. But good wine, interjected Pablo, not rut-gut swill like the last you got. I didn't pay for it, said Pilon. Someone hid it in the grass by the dance hall. What can you expect of wine you find? They sat and waved their hands listlessly at the flies. Cornelia Ruiz cut up the black Mexican yesterday, Pilon observed. Pablo raised his eyes in mild interest. Fight? He asked. Oh no, the black one did not know Cornelia got a new man yesterday, and he tried to come in, so Cornelia cut him. He should have known, Pablo said virtuously. Well, he was down in the town when Cornelia got her new man. The black one just tried to go in through the window when she locked the door. The black one is a fool, said Pilon. Is he dead? Oh, no. She just cut him up a little bit on the arms. Cornelia was not angry. She just didn't want the black one to come in. Cornelia is not a very steady woman, said Pablo. But still, she has masses sung for her father, 10 years dead. He will need them, Pilon observed. He was a bad man and never went to jail for it. And he never went to confession. When old Ruiz was dying, the priest came to give him solace, and Ruiz confessed. Cornelia says the priest was white as buckskin when he came out of the sick room. But afterwards, that priest said he didn't believe half of what Ruiz confessed. Pablo, with a cat-like stroke, killed a fly that landed on his knee. Ruiz was always a liar, he said. That soul will need plenty of masses. But do you think a mass has virtue when the money for that mass comes out of men's pockets while they sleep in wine at Cornelia's house? A mass is a mass, said Pilon, where you get 2 bits of no interest to the man who sells you a glass of wine. And where a mass comes from is of no interest to God. He just likes them, the same as you like wine. Father Murphy used to go fishing all the time, and for months the Holy Sacrament tasted like mackerel. But that did not make it less holy. These things are for priests to explain. They are nothing for us to worry about. I wonder where we can get some eggs to eat. It would be good to eat an egg now. Pablo tilted his hat down over his eyes to keep the sun from bothering him. Charlie Mueller told me that Danny is with Rosa Martin, that Portugee girl. Pilon sat upright in alarm. Maybe that girl will want to marry Danny. Those Portuguese always want to marry, and they love money. Maybe when they are married, Danny will bother us about the rent. That Rosa will want new dresses. All women do. I know them. Pablo, too, looked annoyed. Maybe if we went and talked to Danny, he suggested. Maybe Danny has some eggs, said Pilon. Those chickens of Mrs. Morales are good layers. They put on their shoes and walked slowly toward Danny's house. Pilon stooped and picked up a beer bottle cap and cursed and threw it down. Some evil man has left it there to deceive people, he said. I tried it last night, said Pablo. He looked into a yard where the green corn was ripe and made a mental note of its ripeness. They found Danny sitting on his front porch behind the rose bush, wriggling his toes to keep the flies off. Ay, amigos, he greeted them listlessly. They sat down beside him and took off their hats and their shoes. Danny took out a sack of tobacco and some papers and passed them to Pilon. Pilon looked mildly shocked, but made no comment. Cornelia Ruiz cut up the black Mexican, he said. I heard about it, said Danny. Pablo spoke acidly. These women, there is no virtue in them anymore. It is dangerous to lie with them, said Pilon. I have heard that there is one young Portugee girl here on the flat who can give a man something to remember her by, if he goes to the trouble to get it. Pablo made disapproving clucking noises with his tongue. He spread his hands in front of him. What is a man to do, he asked. Is there no one to trust? They watched Danny's face and saw no alarm appear there. The girl's name is Rosa, said Pilon. I would not say her last name. Oh, you mean Rosa Martin, Danny observed, with very little interest. Well, what can you expect of a Portugee? Pablo and Pilon sighed with relief. How are Mrs. Morales' chickens getting along? Pilon asked casually. Danny shook his head sadly. Every one of those chickens is dead. Mrs. Morales put up some string beans in jars, and the jars blew up, and she fed the beans to the chickens, and these chickens all died, every one. Where are those chickens now? Pablo demanded. Danny waved 2 fingers back and forth in negation. Someone told Mrs. Morales not to eat those chickens or she would be sick. But we scraped the insides good and sold them to the butcher. Has anybody died? Pablo asked. No, I guess those chickens would have been all right. Perhaps you bought a little wine with the money from those chickens, Pilon suggested. Danny smiled cynically at him. Mrs. Morales did, and I went to her house last night. That is a pretty woman in some lights, and not so old either. The alarm came back to Pablo and Pilon. My cousin Wheelie says she is 50 years old, Pilon said excitedly. Danny spread his hands. What is it how old in years she is, he observed philosophically. She is lively, that one. She owns her house and has $200 in the bank. Then Danny became a little embarrassed. I would like to make a present to Mrs. Morales. Pilon and Pablo regarded their feet and tried by strenuous mental effort to ward off what was coming, but their effort had no value. If I had a little money, said Danny, I would buy her a box of big candy. He looked meaningly at his tenants, but neither one answered him. I would need only $1 or 2, he suggested. Chin Key is drying squids, Pilon observed. Perhaps you could cut squids for half a day. Danny spoke pointedly. It would not look well for a man who owns 2 houses to cut squids, but perhaps if a little rent were ever paid... Pilon arose angrily. Always the rent, he cried. You would force us into the streets, into the gutters, while you sleep in your soft bed. Come, Pablo, Pilon said angrily. We will get money for this miser, this Jew. The 2 of them stalked off. Where will we get money? Pablo asked. I don't know, said Pilon. Maybe you won't ask again. But the inhuman demand had cut deep into their mental peace. We will call him Old Jew when we see him, said Pilon. We have been his friends for years. When he was in need, we fed him. When he was cold, we clothed him. When was that? Pablo asked. Well, we would have, if he needed anything and we had it. That is the kind of friends we were to him. And now he crushes our friendship into the ground for a box of big candy to give to an old fat woman. Candy is not good for people, said Pablo. Such emotion had exhausted Pilon. He sat down in the ditch beside the road and put his chin in his hand and was disconsolate. Pablo sat down too, but he only did it to rest, for his friendship with Danny was not as old and beautiful as Pilon's was. The bottom of the ditch was choked with dry grass and bushes. Pilon, staring downward in his sorrow and resentment, saw a human arm sticking out from under a bush, and then, beside the arm, a half-full gallon bottle of wine. He clutched Pablo's arm and pointed. Pablo stared. Maybe he is dead, Pilon. Pilon had got his breath and his fine, clear vision again. If he is dead, the wine will do him good. He can't be buried with it. The arm stirred, swept back the bushes, and disclosed the frowsy face and red stubble beard of JESUS Maria Corcoran. Ay, Pilon, ay, Pablo, he said hazily. Que Tomas? Pilon leaped down the bank on him. Amigo, JESUS Maria! You are not well. JESUS Maria smiled sweetly. Just drunk, he murmured. He rose to his knees. Come have a drink, my friends. Drink deep. There is plenty more. Pilon tilted the bottle over his elbow. He swallowed 4 times, and over a pint left the jug. Then Pablo took the bottle from him, and Pablo played with it as a cat plays with a feather. He polished the mouth with his sleeve. He smelled the wine. He took 3 or 4 preliminary sips and let a few drops run all around his mouth to tantalize himself. At last, "Madre de Dios, que vino," he said. He raised the jug, and the red wine gurgled happily down his throat. Pilon's hand was out long before Pablo had to breathe again. Pilon turned a soft and admiring countenance to his friend, Jesus Maria. "Hast thou discovered a treasure in the woods?" he asked. "Has some great man died and named thee in his will, my little friend?" Jesus Maria was a humanitarian, and kindness was always in him. He cleared his throat and spat. "Give me a drink," he said. "My throat is dry. I will tell you how it was." He drank dreamily, like a man who has so much wine that he can take his time in drinking it, can even spill a little without remorse. "I was sleeping on the beach 2 nights ago," he said, "out on the beach nearest seaside. In the night the little waves washed a rowboat to the shore. Oh, a nice little rowboat, and the oars were there. I got in and rowed it down to Monterey. It was easily worth $20, but trade was slow, and I only got 7. "Thou hast money left?" Pilon put it excitedly. "I am telling you how it was," Jesus Maria said with some dignity. "I bought 2 gallons of wine and brought them up here to the woods, and then I went to walk with Arabella Gross. For her, I bought 1 pair of silk drawers in Monterey. She liked them, so soft they were and so pink. And I bought a pint of whiskey for Arabella, and then after a while we met some soldiers, and she went away with them." "Oh, the thief of a good man's money!" Pilon cried in horror. "No," said Jesus Maria dreamily. "It was time she went away, and then I came here and went to sleep." "Then thou hast no more money?" "I don't know," said Jesus Maria. "I will see." He fished in his pocket and brought out 3 crumpled dollar bills and a dime. "Tonight," he said, "I will buy for Arabella Gross one of those little things that goes around higher up." "You mean the little silk pockets on a string?" "Yes," said Jesus Maria, "and not so little as you might think either." He coughed to clear his throat. Instantly, Pilon was filled with solicitude. "It is the night air," he said. "It is not good to sleep out in the open. Come, Pablo, we will take him to our house and cure this cold of his. The malady of the lungs has a good start, but we will cure it." "What are you talking about?" said Jesus Maria. "I'm all right." "So you think," said Pilon. "So Rodolfo Kelling thought, and you yourself went to his funeral a month ago. So Angelina Vasquez thought. She died last week." Jesus Maria was frightened. "What do you think is the matter?" "It is sleeping in this night air," Pilon said sagely. "Your lungs will not stand it." Pablo wrapped the wine jug in a big weed, so disguising it that anyone passing would have been consumed with curiosity until he knew what that weed contained. Pablo walked beside Jesus Maria, touching him now and then under the elbow to remind him that he was not a well man. They took him to their house and laid him on a cot, and although the day was warm, they covered him with an old comforter. Pablo spoke movingly of those poor ones who writhed and suffered with tuberculosis. And then Pilon pitched his voice to sweetness. He spoke with reverence of the joy of living in a little house. When the night was far gone and all the talk and wine were gone, and outside the deadly mists clung to the ground like the ghosts of giant leeches, then one did not go out to lie in the sickly damp of a gulch. No, one got into a deep, soft, warm bed and slept like a little child. Jesus Maria went to sleep at this point. Pilon and Pablo had to wake him up and give him a drink. Then Pilon spoke movingly of the mornings when one lay in one's warm nest until the sun was high enough to be of some use. One did not go shivering about in the dawn, beating one's hands to keep them from freezing. At last Pilon and Pablo moved in on Jesus Maria as two silent hunting Airedales converge on their prey. They rented the use of their house to Jesus Maria for $15 a month. He accepted happily. They shook hands all around. The jug came out of its weed. Pilon drank deeply, for he knew his hardest task was before him. He said it very gently and casually, while Jesus Maria was drinking out of the bottle. "And you will pay only $3 on account now." Jesus Maria put down the bottle and looked at him in horror. "No," he exploded. "I made a promise to Arabella Gross to buy one of those little things. I will pay the rent when it is time." Pilon knew he had blundered. When you lay on that beach at Seaside, God floated the little rowboat to you. Do you think the good God did it so you could buy silk drawers for a cannery slut? No. God did it so you would not die from sleeping on the ground in the cold. Do you think God is interested in Arabella's breast? And besides, we will take a $2 deposit, he went on. For $1, you can get one of those things big enough to hold the udders of a cow. Still, Jesus Maria protested. "I will tell you," Pilon went on, "unless we pay Danny $2, we shall all be turned into the street, and it will be your fault. You will have it on your soul that we sleep in ditches." Under so many shots coming from so many directions, JESUS MARIA CORCORAN succumbed. He passed 2 of the crumpled bills to Pilon. And now the tense feeling went out of the room, and peace and quiet and a warm, deep comradeship took its place. Pilon relaxed. Pablo took the comforter back to his own bed, and conversations sprang up. "We must take this money to Danny." Their first appetite over, they were sipping the wine out of fruit jars now. "What is this great need Danny has for $2? Jesus Maria asked. Pilon grew confidential. His hands came into play like twin moths, restrained only by his wrists and arms from flying out the door. "Danny, our friend, is taking up with Mrs. Morales. Oh, don't think Danny is a fool. Mrs. Morales has $200 in the bank. Danny wants to buy a box of big candy for Mrs. Morales." "Candy is not good for people," Pilon observed. "It makes their teeth ache." "That is up to Danny," said Jesus Maria. "If he wants to ache Mrs. Morales' teeth, that is his business. What do we care for Mrs. Morales' teeth?" A cloud of anxiety had settled on Pilon's face. "But," he interposed sternly, "if our friend Danny takes big candy to Mrs. Morales, he will eat some too. So it is the teeth of our friend that will ache." Pablo shook his head anxiously. "It would be a bad thing if Danny's friends, on whom he depends, should bring about the aching of his teeth." "What shall we do then?" asked Jesus Maria, although he and everyone else knew exactly what they would do. They waited politely, each one for another to make the inevitable suggestion. The silence ran on. Pilon and Pablo felt that the suggestion should not come from them, since by some lines of reasoning they might be considered interested party. Jesus Maria kept silence in duty to his hosts, but when their silence made him aware of what was required of him, he came instantly into the breach. "A gallon of wine makes a nice present for a lady," he suggested in a musing tone. Pilon and Pablo were astonished at his brilliance. "We can tell Danny it would be better for his teeth to get wine. But maybe Danny will pay no heed to our warning. If you give money to that Danny, you can't tell what he will do with it. He might buy candy anyway, and then all of our time and worry are wasted." They had made of Jesus Maria their feeder of lines, the opener of uneasy situations. Maybe if we buy the wine ourselves, then give it to Danny, there is no danger, he suggested. That is the thing, cried Pilon. Now you have it. Jesus Maria smiled modestly at being given credit for this. He felt that sooner or later this principle would have been promulgated by someone in the room. Pablo poured the last bit of wine into the fruit jars, and they drank tiredly after their effort. It was a matter of pride to them that the idea had been arrived at so logically and in such a philanthropic cause. Now I am hungry, said Pablo. Pilon got up and went to the door and looked at the sun. It is afternoon, he said. Pablo and I will go to Torelli's to get the wine, while you, Jesus Maria, go into Monterey for something to eat. Maybe Mrs. Bruno, on the wharf, will give you a fish. Maybe you can get a little bread someplace. I would rather go with you, said Jesus Maria, for he suspected that another sequence just as logical and just as inevitable was beginning to grow in the hands of his friends. No, Jesus Maria, they said firmly, it is now 2:00, or about that. In an hour it will be 3:00. Then we will meet you here and have something to eat, and maybe a little glass of wine to go with it. Jesus Maria started for Monterey very reluctantly, but Pablo and Pilon walked happily down the hill toward Torelli's house. Chapter 5. How St. Francis turned the tide and put a gentle punishment on Pilon and Pablo and Jesus Maria. The afternoon came down as imperceptibly as age comes to a happy man. A little gold entered into the sunlight. The bay became bluer and dimpled with shore wind ripples. Those lonely fishermen who believed that the fish bite at high tide left their rocks, and their places were taken by others, who were convinced that the fish bite at low tide. At 3:00, the wind veered around and blew softly in from the bay, bringing all manner of fine kelp odors. The menders of nets in the vacant lots of Monterey put down their spindles and rolled cigarettes. Through the streets of the town, fat ladies in whose eyes lay the wariness and the wisdom one sees so often in the eyes of pigs, were trundled in overpowered motor cars toward tea and gin fizzes at the Hotel Del Monte. On Alvarado Street, Hugo Machado, the tailor, put a sign in his shop door, "Back in 5 minutes," and went home for the day. The pines waved slowly and voluptuously. The hens in 100 hen yards complained in placid voices of their evil lot. Pilon and Pablo sat under a pink rose of Castile in Torelli's yard and quietly drank wine and let the afternoon grow on them as gradually as hair grows. "It is just as well that we do not take 2 gallons of wine to Danny," said Pilon. "He is a man who knows little restraint in drinking." Pablo agreed. "Danny looks healthy," he said, "but it is just such people that you hear of dying every day. Look at Rodolfo Kelling. Look at Angelina Vasquez." Pilon's realism arose mildly to the surface. "Rodolfo fell into the quarry above Pacific Grove," he observed in mild reproof. "Angelina ate a bad can of fish, but," he continued kindly, "I know what you mean, and there are plenty of people who die through abuse of wine." All Monterey began to make gradual instinctive preparations against the night. Mrs. Gutierrez cut little chilies in her enchilada sauce. Rupert Hogan, the seller of spirits, added water to his gin and put it away to be served after midnight. And he shook a little pepper into his early evening whiskey. At El Paseo Dancing Pavilion, Bullet Rosendale opened a carton of pretzels and arranged them like a coarse brown lace on the big courtesy plates. The Palace Drug Company wound up its awnings. A little group of men who had spent the afternoon in front of the post office, greeting their friends, moved toward the station to see the Del Monte Express from San Francisco come in. The seagulls arose, gutted from the fish cannery beaches, and flew toward the sea rocks. Lines of pelicans pounded doggedly over the water wherever they go to spend the night. On the purse seine fishing boats, the Italian men folded their nets over the big rollers. Little Miss Alma Alvarez, who was 90 years old, took her daily bouquet of pink geraniums to the Virgin on the outer wall of the Church of San Carlos. In the neighboring and Methodist village of Pacific Grove, the WCTU met for tea and discussion, listened while a little lady described the vice and prostitution of Monterey with energy and color. She thought a committee should visit these resorts to see exactly how terrible conditions really were. They had gone over the situation so often, and they needed new facts. The sun went westering and took on an orange blush. Under the rose bush in Torelli's yard, Pablo and Pilon finished the first gallon of wine. Torelli came out of his house and passed out of the yard without seeing his erstwhile customers. They waited until he was out of sight on the way to Monterey, whereupon Pablo and Pilon went into the house and, with conscious knowledge of their art, cozened their supper out of Mrs. Torelli. They slapped her on the buttocks and called her a butter duck, and took little courteous liberties with her person, and finally left her, flattered and slightly tousled. Now it was evening in Monterey, and the lights went on. The windows glowed softly. The Monterey Theater began to spell, children of hell, over and over with its lights. A small but fanatic group of men who believed that the fish bite in the evening took their places on the cold sea rocks. A little fog drifted through the streets and hung about the chimneys, and a fine smell of burning pine wood filled the air. Pablo and Pilon went back to their rose bush and sat on the ground, but they were not as contented as they had been. "It is cool here," said Pilon, and he took a drink of wine to warm himself. "We should go out to our own house where it is warm," said Pablo. "But there is no wood for the stove." "Well," said Pablo, "if you will take the wine, I will meet you at the corner of the street." And he did, in about half an hour. Pilon waited patiently, for he knew there are some things even one's friends cannot help with. While he waited, Pilon kept a watchful eye aimed down the street in the direction Torelli had taken, for Torelli was a forceful man to whom explanations, no matter how carefully considered, nor how beautifully phrased, were as chaff. Moreover, Torelli had, Pilon knew, the Italians' exaggerated and wholly quixotic ideal of marital relations. But Pilon watched in vain. No Torelli came brutally home. In a little while Pablo joined him, and Pilon noticed with admiration and satisfaction that he carried an armful of pine sticks from Torelli's woodpile. Pablo made no comment on his recent adventure until they arrived at their house. Then he echoed Danny's words. "A lively one, that butter duck." Pilon nodded his head in the dark and spoke with a quiet philosophy. "It is seldom that one finds all things at one market. Wine, food, love, and firewood. We must remember Torelli, Pablo, my friend. There is a man to know. We must take him a little present sometime." Pilon built a roaring fire in the cast-iron stove. The two friends drew their chairs close and held their fruit jars to the heat to warm the wine a little. This night the light was holy, for Pablo had brought a candle to burn for San Francisco. Something had distracted his attention before that sacred plan had been consummated. Now the little wax paper burned beautifully in an abalone shell, and it threw the shadows of Pablo and Pilon on the wall and made them dance. "I wonder where that JESUS Maria has gone," Pilon observed. "He promised he would come back long ago," said Pablo. I do not know whether that is a man to trust or not. Perhaps some little thing happened to detain him, Pablo. Jesus Maria, with that red beard and that kind heart, is nearly always in some kind of trouble with ladies. His is a grasshopper brain, said Pablo. He sings and plays and jumps. There is no seriousness in him. They had no great time to wait. They had barely started their second fruit jar of wine when Jesus Maria staggered in. He held each side of the door to steady himself. His shirt was torn and his face was bloody. One eye showed dark and ominous in the dancing candlelight. Pablo and Pilon rushed to him. Our friend, he is hurt. He has fallen from a cliff. He has been run over by a train. There was not the slightest tone of satire, but Jesus Maria knew it for the most deadly kind of satire. He glared at them out of the eye which still had some volition in such matters. Both thy mothers were udderless cows, he remarked. They fell back from him in horror at the vulgarity of the curse. Our friend is wandering in his mind. The bone of his head has been broken. Pour him a little wine, Pablo. Jesus Maria sat morosely by the fire and caressed his fruit jars, while his friends waited patiently for an explanation of the tragedy. But Jesus Maria seemed content to leave his friends in ignorance of the mishap. Although Pilon cleared his throat several times, and although Pablo looked at Jesus Maria with eyes which offered sympathy and understanding, Jesus Maria sat sullenly and glared at the stove and at the wine and at the blessed candle until at length his discourteous reticence drove Pilon to an equal discourtesy. Afterward, he did not see how he could have done it. Those soldiers again? He asked. Yes, Jesus Maria growled. This time they came too soon. There must have been 20 of them to have used thee so, Pablo observed, for the good of his friend's spirit. Everyone knows thou art a bad man in a fight. And Jesus Maria did look a little happier then. They were 4, he said. Arabella Gross helped too. She hit me on the head with a rock. Pilon felt a wave of more resentment rising within him. I would not remind thee, he said severely, how thy friends warned thee against this cannery slob. He wondered whether he had warned Jesus Maria, and seemed to remember that he had. These cheap white girls are vicious, my friend, Pablo broke in. But did you give her that little thing that goes around? Jesus Maria reached into his pocket and brought out a crumpled pink rayon brassiere. The time had not come, he said. I was just getting to that point, and besides, we had not come into the woods yet. Pilon sniffed the air and shook his head, but not without a certain sad tolerance. Thou hast been drinking whiskey. Jesus Maria nodded. Where did this whiskey come from? From those soldiers, said Jesus Maria. They had it under a culvert. Arabella knew it was there, and she told me. But those soldiers saw us with the bottle. The story was gradually taking shape. Pilon liked it this way. It ruined a story to have it all come out quickly. The good story lay in half-told things which must be filled in out of the hearer's own experience. He took the pink brassiere from Jesus Maria's lap and ran his fingers over it, and his eyes went to musing. But then, in a moment, they shone with a joyous light. I know, he cried. We'll give this thing to Danny as a gift to Mrs. Morales. Everyone except Jesus Maria applauded the idea, and he felt himself hopelessly outnumbered. Pablo, with a delicate understanding of the defeat, filled up Jesus Maria's fruit jar. When a little time had passed, all 3 men began to smile. Pilon told a very funny story of a thing that had happened to his father. Good spirits returned to the company. They sang. Jesus Maria did a shuffling dance to prove he was not badly hurt. The wine went down and down in the jug. But before it was gone, the 3 friends grew sleepy. Pilon and Pablo staggered off to bed, and Jesus Maria lay comfortably on the floor beside the stove. The fire died down. The house was filled with the deep sounds of slumber. In the front room, only one thing moved. The blessed candle darted its little spear-pointed flame up and down with incredible rapidity. Later, this little candle gave Pilon and Pablo and Jesus Maria some ethical things to think about. Simple, small rod of wax with a string through it. Such a thing, you would say, is answerable to certain physical laws and to none other. Its conduct, you would think, was guaranteed by certain principles of heat and combustion. You light the wick. The wax is caught and drawn up the wick. The candle burns a number of hours, goes out, and that is all. The incident is finished. In a little while, the candle is forgotten, and then, of course, it has never existed. Have you forgotten that this candle was blessed? That in a moment of conscience, or perhaps pure religious exaltation, it was designed by Pablo for San Francisco? Here is the principle which takes the waxen rod outside the jurisdiction of physics. The candle aimed its spear of light at heaven like an artist who consumes himself to become divine. The candle grew shorter and shorter. The wind sprang up outside and sifted through the cracks in the wall. The candle sagged sideways. A silken calendar bearing the face of a lovely girl looking out of the heart of an American beauty rose floated out a little distance from the wall. It came into the spear of flame. The fire licked up the silk and raced toward the ceiling. A loose piece of wallpaper caught fire and fell, flaming into a bundle of newspapers. In the sky, saints and martyrs looked on with set and unforgiving faces. The candle was blessed. It belonged to St. Francis. St. Francis will have a big candle in its place tonight. If it were possible to judge depth of sleep, it could be said with justice that Pablo, whose culpable action was responsible for the fire, slept even more soundly than his two friends. But there is no gouge. It can only be said that he slept very, very soundly. The flames ran up the walls and found little holes in the roof and leaked through into the night. The house filled with the roar of fire. Jesus Maria turned over uneasily and began in his sleep to take off his coat. Then a flaming shingle dropped in his face. He leapt up with a cry and stood shocked at the fire that raged about him. "Pilon!" he shrieked. "Pablo!" He ran into the other room, pulled his friends out of bed, and pushed them out of the house. Pilon still grasped the pink brazier in his fingers. They stood outside the burning house and looked in the open, fire-curtained door. They could see the jug standing on the table with a good 2 inches of wine in it. Pilon sensed the savage, incipient heroism of Jesus Maria. "Do not do it," he shouted. "It must be lost in the fire as a punishment on us for leaving it." The cry of sirens came to them and the roar of trucks climbing the hill in second gear from the firehouse in Monterey. The big red fire vehicles drew near, and their searchlights played among the pine trunks. Pilon turned hastily to Jesus Maria. "Run and tell Danny his house is burning. Run quickly, Jesus Maria." "Why don't you go?" "Listen," said Pilon, "Danny does not know you are one who rents his house. He may be a little bit angry with Pablo and me." Jesus Maria grasped his logic and raced toward Danny's house. The house was dark. "Danny!" Jesus Maria cried. "Danny, your house is on fire." There was no answer. "Danny!" he cried again. A window went up in Mrs. Morales' house next door. Danny sounded irritable. "What the hell do you want?" "Your other house is on fire, the one Pablo and Pilon live in." For a moment, Danny did not answer. Then he demanded, "Is the fire department there?" "Yes," cried Jesus Maria. The whole sky was lighted up by now. The crackling of burning timbers could be heard. Well, said Danny, if the fire department can't do anything about it, what does Pilon expect me to do? Jesus Maria heard the window bang shut, and he turned and trotted back toward the fire. It was a bad time to call Danny, he knew. But then how could one tell? If Danny had missed the fire, he might have been angry. Jesus Maria was glad he had told him about it anyway. Now the responsibility lay on Mrs. Morales. It was a little house. There was plenty of draft. The walls were perfectly dry. Perhaps not since old Chinatown had burned had there been such a quick and thorough fire. The men of the fire department took a look at the blazing walls and then began wetting the brush and the trees and the neighboring houses. In less than an hour, the house was completely gone. Only then did the hoses play on the leap of ashes to put out the coals and sparks. Pilon and Pablos and Jesus Maria stood shoulder to shoulder and watched the whole thing. Half the population of Monterey and all of the population of Tortilla Flat, except Danny and Mrs. Morales, stood happily about and watched the fire. At last, when it was all over, when only a cloud of steam arose from the black heap, Pilon turned silently anyway. "Where goest thou?" Pablo called. "I go," said Pilon, "to the woods to have out my sleep. I counsel you to come too. It would be well if Danny does not see us for a little while." They nodded gravely and followed him into the pine forest. "It is a lesson to us," said Pilon. "By this we learn never to leave wine in the house overnight." "Next time," Pilon said hopelessly, "you will take it outside, and someone will steal it."